reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Holy wisdom, holy words, thanks be to God.
If I had my way, meaning that I could wave a magic wand and not only make this happen, but make everyone who thinks it wouldn't be a great idea suddenly think it would be a great idea, our worship service would look more like the worship service of the earliest Christians. I'd love for us to worship more like those folks who knew Jesus in person or had at least spoken to people who knew Jesus in person. I'd love for us to adapt their practices on our own. In particular, if I could wave a magic wand, and again, that means not only that this would happen, but that all the people who might raise their eyebrows at this idea would be enthusiastically on board. We'd end every service with a full meal just like they did. The service would feature hymns and anthems and scripture and prayer, and it would build up to the end where we pass the peace, say the words of institution that signal the beginning of communion, and then dismiss our flocks to go downstairs to the fellowship hall, not as something we do after worship, but as a continuation of the service. And then in the fellowship hall, you'd find the Tupperware containers of everyone who'd been able to bring a dish to share that week. Each table would already be stocked with bread and grape juice, elements which signal to us that Jesus is here and that our meal is more than a simple meal. And we'd celebrate communion around those tables with laughter and stories and deep shared moments as part of worship, as part of the sacrament of communion, as part of the sign that Jesus is here in our midst. And everyone who's out there in the pews this morning currently thinking, oh, for goodness sake, if we actually did that, I would have so much work to do. Everyone who laughed was probably one of the people thinking that. Everyone who has that thought wouldn't worry about it because everyone would pitch in with the cleanup and it would all work out just fine. This, just to be clear, is not an actual proposal I'm making. It's just what would happen if I could wave a magic wand. We would all be a bit more like those people who were closer to Jesus, just a few steps closer to Jesus, at least in terms of history, than we are. Of course, being a bit more like them wouldn't mean that all our problems would go away. There would no doubt be disputes about who would bring what to our weekly potluck communion. There would no doubt be whispers about the family who never manages to bring anything, but always manages to be first in line to eat everyone else's food, even if that family happens to include the pastor. We'd have disputes over paper plates versus real ones. The elder who's supposed to bring the bread and juice would forget one Sunday and all Sheol would break loose. And there'd be a bunch of families who always skip out on cleanup because they're already late for soccer practice. And unlike church, there are actual consequences for missing soccer practice. And even if we somehow didn't have those particular disputes, there would be others. I know this for a fact because all of us here are human beings. And it seems like every time we have a brilliant idea, human beings take it up and it turns out different from what we expected. Sometimes this is for the better. Sometimes people surprise us and do more than we could have ever imagined to show love and hospitality and grace to one another. Sometimes we human beings are pretty amazing, but other times change is for the worse and we can be cruel and unkind to each other. And we can do that also in unimaginable ways. Another way that I know this magic wand practice of every week full meal communion would not exactly fit the ideal image I painted a few minutes ago. Another way I know that it wouldn't be the ideal is that this isn't how it worked out in the earliest churches either. Among those people who knew Jesus in person or knew people who did, they had disputes as well, and their disputes led to the creation of the New Testament. as the Apostle Paul wrote letter after letter to help churches move through their issues. In our reading this morning, we get a glimpse into the issues faced by the church in Corinth, a city that was in ancient Greece that can still be found today. These Corinthians who were in the Corinthian church were real pieces of work. They earned not only one, but two of the longest letters in the New Testament. And in these letters, we know that the Apostle Paul is responding to letters and messages that they've sent to him, that they've been sending him. We've got this issue, one after another. And he responds, here's how I respond to those issues, one after another. And one of their issues was this practice around the table, where everyone brought their own food and drink to church on Sunday, and everyone ate their own meal as part of the communion feast. And again, as we said in our introduction this morning, this was simply following a secular custom, where when someone was hosting a banquet, it was the custom to bring your own food, to bring your own drink to the table. They were simply following a secular custom, but it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't something personal about it too. Paul began his letter to the Corinthians by noting that there were factions among them, that there were defined groups with different ideas about how to live the Christian life. And he brings that up again in our passage this morning, noting that there are divisions among the Corinthians before describing the meals where, again, some people eat more than enough while others look on in hunger and shame. It wouldn't surprise me at all if their factions perhaps had different interpretations about what wealthy Christians should do with their wealth. It wouldn't surprise me if other arguments about sin, salvation, grace, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, or even the meaning of the sacrament itself were part of this practice of not sharing food with everyone around the table. I have no evidence of that. It just wouldn't surprise me. Because I know that we as human beings are prone to fight with each other, and we can sometimes be petty and vindictive when we do. And there's something I've learned about churches over the years. We are often the perfect place for human nature to show itself in the fullest, both the very good and also the very difficult. Here's my theory. The church is a place where the stakes are high enough to make the things that we fight about worth fighting over, but low enough that we can leave if the temperature gets too high. There are certain fights we just can't have with our family members. Everyone knows not to talk politics with Uncle Don or not to discuss scripture around Aunt Jane. Apparently, we've got an Uncle Don in the audience somewhere. We maintain these boundaries so we can maintain the peace. But our families often have issues that are far deeper than these. There's the man who's never been able to impress his father, no matter what he did as a boy or no matter what he's accomplished as an adult, and he brings some of that chip on his shoulder to everything he does at work, at church, or in his family. There's the woman who can never talk to her mother about all the ways that she subtly belittles her. There's the dark secret in our family that we can't talk about because if we even mention it, it stirs up too much pain. In our families, there are certain things we can't say or do because we fear that if we say it, it would destroy everyone. Now, in these situations, I often advocate for talking about it and working through the pain and getting to a place of healing, but I understand why avoiding it often seems better, except in very rare instances, you can't leave your family. So we do what we need to do to maintain the peace and move on. Now, church can be similar to this, but it's also different. In church, we sometimes do the thing I just described. We keep quiet about something that's important to us because we want to keep the peace. Although, if we avoid talking about something in a committee meeting and then whisper about it with all of our friends and ascribe bad intentions to the people who disagree with us and do whatever we can do to undermine them and their ideas, that's not the same thing as keeping the peace. That's saying we're keeping the peace while we're actually causing conflict. But I digress. Churches are more likely to see open conflict. Churches are more likely to see fights that are different from the sort I just described. Churches are more likely to see conflict that's out in the open than families because the stakes are high enough, but also low enough. The stakes are high enough because the color and quality of the carpet in the sanctuary really does matter. This is a place where people connect with God, and the details are important. To give another example, I once heard a pastor in Nebraska say, "I'm going to quit if I have to sit through one more donut meeting." And that sounds ridiculous, multiple meetings about donuts. But this church bought donuts every week for a fellowship time after the service. And that raised questions about where to get the donuts. Do we support a small business in our small town and live out our economic values? Or do we provide the most high quality experience to our members and guests, even if that means supporting a chain? The stakes are genuinely high in these conversations, and their outcomes really do matter. But the stakes are often lower for us than they might be in our families. Except in very rare instances, we're not likely to leave our families, but we might find it a bit easier to leave our church. Even if we've been involved for decades, even if the people around us have become like family, we're always aware of the church around the corner. And our culture has taught us to be good consumers. If I, as the pastor, don't give you what you're looking for, what you're paying for, why not take your business elsewhere? Of course, it is more complicated than that. Our relationship with the church is complicated. It's kind of like being part of a family, and it's kind of like consuming products from a business. It's easier to stop shopping at Target and start shopping at Walmart than it is to leave your church. It's easier to drive past the Phillips 66 because the Quick Trip has better hot dogs than it is to leave your church. But it's also easier to leave your church than your family. The church is somewhere in the middle on that broad continuum. And in the church, disputes are inevitable because we're human beings, because the things we disagree about matter, because sometimes we have emotional tension stored up in our bodies, minds, and souls from all those things we can't talk about with our families, and all that tension has to go somewhere. And it's not like you can just go and tell off your boss. And so in the end, you don't mean to bring all that excess tension to church, but it's there and it has to go somewhere, and it just comes out in the donut meeting, and Phyllis bears the brunt of it. Today is World Communion Sunday, when we celebrate our connection with believers around the world. Across every human barrier and boundary, every human division and faction, and I believe it would be easier for us to celebrate our connection with people in Guatemala and Indonesia, with people in Ethiopia and Poland, with immigrants who come to the United States, with people who live in the inner city and in rural areas just a few miles away from us, with people who have different political beliefs who are right around the corner from us. I believe it would be easier to celebrate our connections with people across these boundaries and divisions if it was also easier to celebrate our connection with one another. And that's why I want to revive an old tradition this morning. You see, as we mentioned in our welcome this morning, the earliest Christians had a tradition. Those people who either knew Jesus or knew people who knew him, when they worshiped, they passed the peace before communion. They used it not as a simple time of greeting one another, but to exchange signs of peace when there was conflict, to resolve disputes that were hanging over their heads and preventing them from communing with a full heart. And now I should say at this point that I don't consider us to be a church that has more conflict than any other. I don't consider us to be a church that is particularly conflicted or particularly factioned. I just know that we're people. And I think probably some of the things I said this morning about the inevitability of conflict could be said in any congregation anywhere in the world. And hey, that's another thing that connects us across all those boundaries and divisions and borders, is that we're all people. We're all beautifully capable of great good and all beautifully flawed as well. That's just part of the human package. But when the earliest Christians celebrated communion, when they were preparing for communion, they passed the peace with one another as a way of resolving tension, as a way of settling disputes before they came to the table to participate in this sacrament of oneness with each other and oneness with Jesus Christ. I should say also that I believe when Scripture asks us to examine our hearts before communion, that this is not because we'll be condemned to hell if we have a sin hanging over our shoulders and we come to the communion table and we haven't resolved it yet. I know some of us grew up in traditions where we were taught exactly that before coming to communion, you confess and you clear your heart of every sin, and only when you feel like you're pure enough, that's when you come to the table. I don't think that's what Scripture is telling us in the passage from Matthew that we read this morning, or in the words of Paul, which come a little bit after our reading from 1 Corinthians this morning. I think Scripture is telling us to examine our hearts, but it's telling us to do that because if you have some tension sitting around in there, it's harder to come to the table with a full heart. If you have some dispute that is keeping you from feeling like you're at one with everyone in the room, it's hard to come to the table with a full heart. Examine yourself, not because you're in fear of judgment, but examine yourself because when we are ready for communion, it is at its best. When we are ready for communion, it is the most meaningful it can be. When we're ready to share with everyone in the room, when we don't feel like there are invisible boundaries separating us from the person who's next to us in the pew, we are able to come with the table with a full heart and experience the full meaning of communion in order for communion to be at its best. Let's examine our hearts so that we can come to it as one body, prepared to celebrate our oneness with each other and with believers around the world. So this morning, I'm going to ask you to pass the peace before communion, and we're going to move into that ritual in a moment. Here's what I want you to do as you pass the peace. Think about someone with whom you stand in need of reconciliation. Now, this morning, as you pass the peace, you're going to pass the peace with a lot of people. You're going to say hello to a lot of people. No one has to know that they're the one person you're seeking out. But I want you to think about if there's someone in this room with whom you stand in need of reconciliation, make a point of finding that person and passing the peace with them. And again, you're going to greet a lot of people. No one has to know that they're the one person you sought out. But if there's some place where reconciliation is needed, find that one person. Now, if you look around the room and you don't see any need for reconciliation anywhere, I want to invite you to look for moments of reconnection. Maybe there's someone who's sitting here who you don't know their name and you feel like you've seen them often enough that it's too late and you can't ask them for their name now. I give you full permission to ask them for their name this morning. If you look around the room and you see someone who you haven't talked to in months, maybe because they worship at 8:30 and you worship at 11, make a point of going up and sharing the peace with that person. Reconciliation or reconnection. That's what we're looking for this morning. Reconciliation or reconnection. Now, you'll know that this time of passing the peace is coming to an end because you'll hear a song coming from up here on the chancel. The song is Let Us Break Bread Together, which is a song that is familiar to many of us. As you hear that song beginning, first softly and then a little bit louder, I want you to go ahead and begin singing if you know the words and start moving towards a circle. There's going to be a host at every circle who will help you find your place in the circle, who will help us to form nice, neat, orderly ways of being with one another. As you hear the song, start moving toward a circle. As we form into circles, we'll then begin the communion ritual. For now, let us pass the peace with one another. May the peace of Christ be with you. Let us exchange signs of peace.